Karen crouched in the shadows of the dense foliage, her cold, calculating gaze fixed on the target a mile away. The human diplomat moved with calm precision, his every step guarded by a handful of soldiers. His purpose was clear: to secure peace. But peace wasn't something the Torvath valued. To them, peace was weakness, an indulgence for species that hadn't been forged in the fires of battle. Karen's mission was simple: eliminate the diplomat, send a message, and remind the galaxy that humans were beneath them, fragile in their hope for diplomacy. She adjusted her breathing, silencing the inner turmoil that occasionally surfaced. For years, Karen had been the Torvath's most trusted assassin, their blade in the shadows. She had completed countless missions, eliminating targets without question or hesitation. But this one felt different. As she peered through her scope, the flicker of doubt she had buried for so long crept into her thoughts. Humans weren't like the other species she had encountered. They were persistent, resilient even. She had seen reports of them surviving against all odds, thriving where other species would perish. And they didn't fight just for themselves, they fought for ideals, for people they cared about. It was a trait she had never understood in her people. But orders were orders. Karen couldn't afford to question them. The Torvath had no place for doubt, no room for hesitation. Her hand tightened around the trigger as she prepared to take the shot, but something felt off. She glanced at her surroundings, instincts honed from years of battle alerting her to unseen danger. Before she could react, the explosion hit. A sharp, searing pain tore through her side, and the world erupted in chaos. The ambush had come out of nowhere. Torvath operatives, her own people, emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on her. Betrayal flashed through her mind as she scrambled for cover, blood soaking through her armor. Her mission had been compromised from the start. They had never intended for her to return. She was expendable. Fighting off the wave of dizziness, Karen managed to dodge the first volley of shots, returning fire with deadly precision. But her escape was cut short when her ship, stationed a few hundred meters away, was hit by a second explosion. Flames erupted from the wreckage, and her only chance of survival vanished in an instant. She had been left to die on this godforsaken planet, alone, wounded, and abandoned. She dragged herself through the thick underbrush, every step a reminder of her failure. Her vision blurred as the toxic atmosphere of the planet assaulted her lungs, and the sound of distant predators echoed in the background. Karen knew she didn't have long. The wound on her side wasn't just painful, it was lethal. Her blood loss was becoming too much, and the hostile environment was only accelerating her decline. But the Torvath had trained her for this. They had conditioned her to withstand pain, to embrace suffering, and to fight until her last breath. Still, the betrayal gnawed at her. Her superiors had seen her as a liability, a tool to be discarded once her usefulness had run its course. She had given everything to the Torvath, had sacrificed any semblance of a life for the glory of their empire, and this was her reward: abandonment and disgrace. They had left her here, on this desolate, barren world, surrounded by nothing but death. The planet itself seemed intent on consuming her. The air was thick with toxic gases, making it difficult to breathe without her helmet, and the wildlife was equally unforgiving. She had seen one of the creatures from a distance, a massive beast with fangs that could crush through metal, its eyes glowing in the dim light of the planet's twin suns. The predators on this world were ruthless, much like her own people. They hunted without mercy, and now Karen, the predator, had become the prey. She found a cave, a temporary reprieve from the relentless danger outside. Collapsing onto the cold, rocky floor, she leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow and ragged. Blood pooled beneath her, the pain now a dull, persistent throb that threatened to pull her into unconsciousness. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment of the ambush, the realization that she had been set up by her own kind. There was no honor in this, no glory. It was a calculated execution, carried out by those she had trusted. But Karen wasn't ready to die. Not yet. She had endured too much, fought too hard, to let it end like this. Her mind raced with plans of survival, but each one seemed more impossible than the last. Without her ship, there was no way off the planet. Her communicator was damaged beyond repair, and the Torvith would never send a rescue party. They had made sure of that. She could hear the creatures outside, their low growls and heavy footsteps a constant reminder that death was closing in. But even as the weight of hopelessness threatened to crush her, Karen refused to give up. She wasn't like the other assassins. She had survived missions others couldn't, had emerged victorious when the odds were stacked against her. There was still a part of her that clung to life, that refused to let go of the fight. It was a primal instinct buried deep within her, an instinct that had kept her alive for years. She shifted, wincing as the pain flared through her side, and scanned the cave for anything she could use to her advantage. The darkness enveloped her, cold and unforgiving, but it provided some semblance of safety from the predators outside. She would wait, gather her strength, and when the time came, she would find a way to survive. She always had. The minutes dragged into hours, and Karen's mind wandered to thoughts she rarely allowed herself to entertain. She had never questioned the Torvith's way of life before. From the time she could remember, she had been taught that strength was all that mattered, that compassion was a weakness to be exploited. But now, lying here, bleeding and broken, she wondered if there was something more. The humans she had been sent to destroy, the diplomats she had targeted, they fought for peace, not dominance. It was an alien concept to her, one she had never truly understood. But maybe, just maybe, there was a strength in that too. Alexander Reed sat in the cockpit of his small, weathered ship, surveying the desolate planet below. His life as a human explorer was far from glamorous, but it was the kind of solitude he had grown accustomed to after years of fighting in wars that left him feeling more disconnected than before. He had fought in battles against the Torvith, watched comrades fall, and buried the pain deep within. Out here, on the fringes of known space, no one asked about the scars. The endless horizons of unexplored worlds provided enough distraction to quiet the memories. His ship's scanner pinged softly, pulling him out of his reverie. A life sign. Reed frowned. This planet wasn't known for supporting complex life forms beyond the hostile wildlife, let alone sentient beings. Curiosity piqued, he keyed in a few commands and confirmed it. A single life sign, faint and irregular, but undeniably there. He weighed his options. It could be a trap, or it could be nothing. But the thought of leaving someone out there, potentially injured, didn't sit right with him. He'd seen enough people left behind in war, abandoned in the chaos of battle. The scanner pinged again, insistently. Whoever it was, they didn't have long. Reed sighed, his sense of duty getting the better of him. He strapped in, adjusted the ship's trajectory, and descended toward the coordinates. The terrain was rugged, marked by jagged cliffs and treacherous valleys, making landing a delicate process. After securing his ship, Reed set out, his breath masked by the filtration system in his helmet. The air here was thick with toxins, the kind that would kill most life within minutes. The landscape was devoid of color, save for the occasional glint of some metallic debris. The wreckage of a ship came into view, a Torvith vessel. Reed's muscles tensed instinctively at the sight of it. He hadn't encountered the Torvith in years, but the memories of their brutal tactics were still fresh. His pace quickened as he reached the wreckage and found her. Karen was barely alive. Her breathing was shallow, her body covered in deep wounds that were bleeding out onto the ground beneath her. At first glance, Reed didn't recognize her species, her features unfamiliar beneath the layer of grime and injuries. But as he knelt down, his training kicked in, and he saw the telltale signs, the armor, the weaponry, the facial markings. She was Torvith. Reed felt a surge of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Rage, distrust, the memories of lost comrades, all of it flared up. He should turn around, leave her here. Let the planet finish what it had started. But as he stood there, ready to walk away, something made him stop. She was a person, wounded and dying. It didn't matter that she was Torvith. Not anymore. His training kicked in. First aid was first aid, no matter the species. Gritting his teeth, Reed pulled out his medkit and began working. Karen stirred under his touch, her body tensing as if she was trying to fight back, but she was too weak. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, filled with wariness and fear as she recognized him as human. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. He didn't bother responding. Not yet. There would be time for explanations later. The more pressing concern was keeping her alive. He worked quickly, applying pressure to her wounds, administering painkillers, and using the limited resources he had to stabilize her condition. It was touch and go for a while, but eventually, her breathing steadied. She slipped into unconsciousness again, and Reed took that as a small victory. He needed to get her back to the ship. It wasn't easy, carrying her across the treacherous terrain. Karen was lighter than she looked, but the weight of his decision to save her weighed heavily on him. Why was he doing this? She was Torvith. The same species responsible for the deaths of so many he had known. He hadn't forgotten the terror they had unleashed across human colonies, the way they fought without mercy. And yet, here he was, risking his life for one of them. Maybe it was the isolation getting to him, or maybe it was something else, a nagging sense that leaving her to die made him no better than those he had fought against. Back at the ship, Reed placed her in the small medical bay. The advanced healing equipment worked much faster than his field medkit, and over the next few hours, her condition began to stabilize. He kept an eye on her vitals, checking in periodically as he went about his routine. Days passed like this, Reed tending to her wounds, keeping her fed and hydrated, and making sure the ship's systems were running smoothly. During this time, Karen remained distant, both physically and mentally. Whenever she regained consciousness, her first reaction was always one of defense. She'd flinch when he came near or glare at him with suspicion, her training still ingrained deeply despite her weakened state. It didn't help that she recognized him as human, a race she had been conditioned to see as inferior, perhaps even an enemy. Reed tried to bridge the communication gap by installing a translation device. He knew a little of the Torvith language from his time in the military, but it wasn't enough for meaningful conversation. Karen was still too weak to speak much, but when she did, it was in curt, clipped phrases, her hostility evident. He didn't take it personally. After all, if their roles were reversed, he wasn't sure he'd be any more cooperative. The days stretched into nights, and slowly, a fragile routine developed. Karen's strength returned, though she remained on guard. Reed didn't push her to talk, instead letting the silence between them fill the space. But his actions spoke louder than any words. He ensured she had everything she needed, from medical care to food, and didn't ask for anything in return. His patience, something he had cultivated over years of isolation, was steady and unwavering. Karen, for her part, seemed to struggle with this unexpected kindness. Reed noticed the small changes, how she stopped flinching when he approached, how her eyes softened when he checked on her vitals. Her body was healing, but something else was shifting too. Her suspicion remained, but there was a crack in the armor, a vulnerability that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Reed found himself curious about her. The Torvith were a mystery to most humans, seen only as violent conquerors. But here, in the quiet moments when they weren't enemies, he wondered what her story was. How had she ended up here? What had brought her to the brink of death on this desolate planet? Despite her silence, Reed could see the questions in her eyes too. She was beginning to wonder about him. Why was he helping her? Why hadn't he left her to die, as her own people had? The unspoken questions hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. The days following Karen's recovery blended into a tense, uneasy rhythm. She moved more freely now, the wounds Reed had treated healing faster than she expected, thanks to his ship's advanced medical systems. Yet, the underlying tension between them remained. Karen had spent her life trained to view humans as lesser beings, primitive, emotional, and reckless. But as she observed Reed, her perception began to shift. He wasn't like the humans she'd encountered in military briefings or battlefield reports. He worked quietly, diligently, and with a strange blend of caution and confidence. There was a calmness to him, a level of care she hadn't expected from someone who had every reason to distrust her. Their uneasy truce took a turn when the planet's wildlife decided to make a move. One evening, A low rumble reverberated through the ground, growing louder until it became an unsettling roar. Karen tensed. Reed, too, seemed to sense it, the kind of danger that even the air couldn't hide. It was only a matter of time before the source of the noise revealed itself. The creature that emerged was unlike anything Karen had ever seen, a massive, scaled beast, all teeth and muscle, with a hunger in its eyes that sent a chill down her spine. Instinct kicked in. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest weapon Reed had left out, still weak from her injuries, but unwilling to let the beast claim her life without a fight. Reed was already outside, weapon in hand, issuing commands to his ship's defense systems. He fired off a few shots, but the creature seemed unfazed, its thick hide deflecting the blasts. Karen moved to his side, barely registering the surprised look Reed shot her as she joined the fight. She may have been recovering, but she was still Torvith, still a warrior, and she wasn't about to sit back and watch. Together, they engaged the creature in a deadly dance. Karen, though weak, used her combat instincts to anticipate its moves, dodging its powerful strikes. Reed, with his human resilience and adaptability, pressed forward, drawing the creature's attention. They saved each other multiple times during the fight, Reed pulling Karen out of the way of a crushing blow, and Karen driving her blade into the creature's softer underbelly when Reed's blaster shots failed to penetrate its armor. It wasn't easy, but they eventually forced the beast to retreat, injured and defeated. As the dust settled, something unspoken passed between them. A shift. They had fought as equals, as partners. The lines between enemy and ally blurred, replaced by a growing sense of mutual respect. Reed caught his breath, wiping the sweat from his brow, while Karen stood still, her mind racing with the realization that this human, this man she had been trained to despise, was unlike any she'd ever encountered. Later that evening, the tension between them had changed. Where there had once been silence, there was now curiosity. Reed, for the first time, seemed to relax in her presence, setting aside his distrust. Karen, still guarded but intrigued, began asking questions, tentative at first, but then more direct as Reed answered each one without hesitation. He spoke of Earth, of its history, and the people who called it home. His stories were filled with struggles and triumphs, humanity's determination to survive despite the odds. Karen listened in silence, her mind grappling with the contradiction between what she'd been taught and what she was seeing. Humans were supposed to be weak, foolish creatures who relied on brute force to solve their problems. But Reed's stories painted a different picture. He spoke of compassion, of loyalty to friends and family, of the drive to protect others even at great personal cost. It was something the Torvith couldn't comprehend, a form of strength that didn't come from physical power or domination. The more Reed talked, the more Karen began to question her own beliefs. She had always taken pride in being Torvith, in being part of a race that valued strength above all else. But was their version of strength truly superior? Reed had risked his life for her, a sworn enemy, simply because he couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. That kind of compassion would have been seen as weakness among her people, but here, it had saved her life. One night, as they sat in the dim glow of the ship's interior, Reed asked the question that had been hanging in the air for days. "Why were you out here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge of curiosity that Karen couldn't ignore. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. But there was no point in hiding it any longer. "I was sent to assassinate a human diplomat," she finally admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "It was a mission. Simple. Direct." Reed's face didn't change much, but Karen saw the flicker of something in his eyes, surprise maybe. Or disappointment. She couldn't tell. "So you were here to kill one of us," he said slowly, the weight of her confession sinking in. "Yes," Karen replied, meeting his gaze. "But I was betrayed before I could complete the mission. My own people left me to die." Reed nodded, processing the information. He didn't explode with anger or demand answers, as she had half expected him to. Instead, he remained calm, thoughtful. "And now?" he asked after a moment. "Do you still want to kill us?" Karen didn't have an answer for that. The mission, the orders she had followed blindly for so long, They didn't make sense anymore. Not after everything she had seen, everything Reed had done for her. The Torvatha's version of strength, their way of life, felt hollow in comparison to what she had witnessed firsthand. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "I'm not sure of anything anymore." For the first time in a long while, Karen felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Her entire life had been dedicated to serving the Torvath, to following orders without question. But now, those orders seemed meaningless. Her people had abandoned her, discarded her like she was nothing. Yet here was a human, her sworn enemy, who had risked his life for her without expecting anything in return. It was more than confusing. It was shattering the foundation of everything she thought she knew. Reed didn't push her for more answers. He simply nodded, accepting her uncertainty. In the silence that followed, Karen began to see the world, and humanity, through a new lens. Reed wasn't weak. He wasn't reckless. He embodied a strength she had never understood, one rooted in loyalty, honor, and compassion. The bond between them, however unlikely, was growing stronger with each passing day. And Karen knew that this bond, this trust, would change the course of both their lives in ways neither of them could yet foresee. The calm they had managed to carve out between them didn't last long. Karen's people had a reputation for thoroughness, and they wouldn't leave a mission incomplete, not when failure brought dishonor to their name. It was inevitable that they would come for her, especially once they realized she hadn't died on that desolate planet as they had intended. The signal that the Torvath had intercepted from Reed's ship sealed her fate. The hunt had begun. It didn't take long for the Torvath strike team to track them down. The first sign came in the form of a distant, ominous hum in the air, the distinct sound of approaching ships. Karen's instincts, sharpened by years of battle, flared to life. She knew what was coming before Reed even noticed the blips on his radar. Her people were here, and they weren't going to leave until she was dead, along with anyone who had seen too much. Reed glanced at Karen, his expression hardening when he realized the situation. There was no need for words. They both knew what this meant. Karen, once a proud warrior of the Torvath, now stood at the crossroads of her life. She had to choose between the loyalty ingrained in her by years of training and the new understanding she had found through Reed. The tension between them was palpable as they prepared for what was coming. For Karen, it wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about what she had come to believe. The Torvath had taught her that strength came from dominance and fear, that compassion was a weakness to be crushed. But Reed's actions had shown her a different kind of strength, one rooted in loyalty, trust, and a willingness to protect, even at great personal risk. She had to decide which path she was going to follow. The Torvath strike team arrived swiftly, their landings shaking the ground with authority. Reed and Karen stood ready, side by side, weapons in hand. Karen's people wasted no time, emerging from their ships with the brutal efficiency she knew all too well. They had come for her, and Reed was nothing more than collateral damage. But something had shifted in Karen. As the strike team advanced, she felt no loyalty toward them, no desire to prove herself worthy in their eyes. The battle began in earnest. Reed's quick thinking and strategic mind meshed with Karen's combat skills, creating a formidable defense against the well-trained strike team. Reed's resourcefulness came into play as he directed the ship's defenses, using the terrain and every advantage the planet could offer. Karen, still not at full strength, fought alongside him, her blades cutting through the air with precision and purpose. She knew their fighting style better than anyone. After all, she had been one of them. But the turning point came when Karen found herself facing the leader of the strike team, a figure she knew well, one of her former commanders. His eyes narrowed when he saw her standing with a human, his expression a mix of disgust and anger. "You've betrayed your people," he spat, leveling his weapon at her. "You're no Torvath anymore." Karen's heart pounded in her chest, not out of fear, but from the weight of the decision she was about to make. This was the moment. She could either fight for the Torvath code she had once believed in, or she could fight for something more, something Reed had shown her. Without hesitation, she made her choice. "I'm no longer yours to command," Karen replied, her voice steady and firm. She turned her weapon on her former commander, her loyalty now clearly shifted. The battle was short but decisive. With her knowledge of their tactics, and Reed's ingenuity, they defeated the strike team, but not without a cost. The fight was fierce, brutal, and left scars both physical and emotional. When the dust finally settled, Karen stood over the last surviving member of the strike team. The young soldier, barely out of training, looked up at her with fear in his eyes. He was just following orders, much like she had once done. Killing him would be easy, a simple flick of her blade. But Karen hesitated. She saw herself in him, the blind loyalty, the unquestioning obedience. She realized that killing him wouldn't solve anything. Instead of ending his life, she sent him back with a message. Tell them the war between humans and the Torvith ends now. There's no honor in it anymore. As the soldier limped away, Karen felt a strange sense of release. She wasn't that soldier anymore. She had changed, and her people needed to know that strength wasn't found in blind obedience or violence. It was found in the bonds people forged with one another, in trust and compassion. She had learned that from Reed, and now she was ready to stand by that belief, no matter the consequences. It was only after the battle that Karen revealed the truth to Reed. Sitting beside him, catching her breath, she glanced over at him, unsure of how to begin. There's something I didn't tell you before, she admitted. The diplomat I was sent to kill, it was your brother. Reed froze. His expression darkened, but instead of anger, there was only deep contemplation. The weight of her confession hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. She braced herself for his reaction, for the possibility that this would undo everything they had built. But Reed didn't lash out. My brother, he said quietly, his voice thoughtful. And you didn't succeed. That's what matters. The fact that Reed could process such a revelation without hate or rage only deepened Karen's respect for him. This human, who had every reason to hate her, had saved her instead, and now, even after learning the truth, he chose to stand by her side. It was the final proof that everything she had been taught about humans was wrong. Their strength wasn't in their weapons or their tactics. It was in their ability to forgive, to move forward, and to seek peace. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, reaching both human and Torvith leaders. Karen's defiance of her people, combined with Reed's choice to save an enemy, began to shift the long-standing conflict between their races. Leaders on both sides were forced to reconsider the war that had raged for centuries. If a Torvith assassin and a human soldier could find common ground, maybe there was hope for something greater. The diplomatic revolution that followed was slow, but it was real. Peace talks began, tentative at first but growing stronger as both sides saw the potential for a future without bloodshed. Karen's decision to turn against her people, and Reed's act of saving her, became a symbol of what could be achieved if both races were willing to let go of the past.